Now, the IMF also cut its GDP growth forecast for sub-Saharan economies in 2024 by about 20 basis points to 3.6%, and that's compared to its April forecast. Growth rates, the fund says, are nowhere near enough to raise living standards. Now, the fund is repeating its warning that debt service costs are also cutting into desperately needed investments in education and healthcare. Now, hours ago, CGTN's Ramanyang spoke to Abebe Selassie, director of the Africa Department at the International Monetary Fund. He started their conversation by asking him if it was time to drop the comparability of treatment requirements in the G20 Common Framework, and that's in order to speed up debt restructuring for the continent.
It's not the common framework per se that requires this comparability of treatment, but creditors. Creditors want assurances that if they are to give you relief, they want to make sure that others are not going to be treated more favorably than them. So again, creditor coordination is often one of the key things that hold back debt relief from happening fast enough. And so this comparability of treatment consideration is something that's important almost to every creditor. And I'm not sure that headway can be made in terms of agreeing people to quick debt relief if you don't have if you cannot assure them that you're not going to be treating the next person more favorably.
So what needs to be done to make the G20 Common Framework work a lot better? Because back in April, Inimit Gill... Yeah, please,
Rama,
go ahead.
I mean, forgive me, but again, there is kind of, I think, a little bit of an issue here where the common framework is a mechanism for, providing official creditors to provide debt relief. And as I said to you earlier, there's been a lot of learning and it's been delivering quite rapidly. Okay, could it be faster still? Yes, there are some certain things that could be done. Creditors could agree to, provide treatment within a fixed time envelope to encourage countries to come to it, etc. But let's not get stuck on this issue that it has not been working. It has. I mean, in the case of Ethiopia, between staff level agreement and going to the board, it was less than 4 months. So by any standards of debt reprofiling, this is, incredibly rapid. So, I'm not sure why we're stuck on this issue.
Well, I mean, if you're on the receiving end of it, if you're in Zambia or in Ghana or in any other country that might
forgive me. As I said, if the common framework was not in place, if we didn't have a mechanism under which official creditors were going to come and do this, it would have taken even longer. Again, I don't want to make excuses for how long it took for restructuring, the financing assurances to come from official creditors in Zambia or Ghana, but it is increasingly not the main hindrance to moving forward with an IMF-supported program, with World Bank financing.
The report that you put out also essentially says there's the scope to raise taxes by broadening the tax base, making greater use of progressive income and property taxes as well. But looking at the data coming out from both from the fund and the World Bank, per capita incomes across the region are still relatively low. In fact, in some cases, lower than they were pre-pandemic. Doesn't that limit the scope to broaden the tax base?
An important factor, of course, has been that countries have been borrowing to spend and address pressing development needs in health, in education, in infrastructure over the last 10, 15 years. This left countries with, an elevated level of debt. And of course, nobody anticipated the pandemic to come, nor all of the other adverse shocks that have happened. And so, when those happened, also, of course, the debt pressures, debt challenges increased even more acutely. Now, what needs to be done now, of course, is a mixture of things. First and foremost, I think our governments need to do a better job of trying to capture the rates of return on all of the investment that they've made in the past projects through the tax system. Then you come to the issue of, when is it optimal to do this? Is this the right time to do this, given how difficult conditions remain? The cost of living crisis has been more acute in our region than elsewhere. And, it's exactly recognizing that countries need more time. Of course, the IMF often steps in to provide, concessional financing to give countries time over which reforms can be undertaken.
Indeed, and just listening to a lot of the policy debates in Nigeria in the last year or so, the argument that your team also flagged was, the question around how do we sequence these reforms, moving from one specific thing, say, for example, dealing with fuel subsidies to dealing with tax reform and so on and so forth. Are there examples you can give us of countries that have gotten that sequencing right in Sub-Saharan Africa?
The first thing to say is that, once a crisis or acute macroeconomic imbalances present themselves, it becomes really very difficult to find a path through and come out the other side without exacting a heavy toll on society. So what we try and do is, first of all, work with governments who often are best placed to identify exactly the kind of reforms they want to pursue. As I said earlier, these are reforms that have to come from government who have often a better idea of what's feasible to implement. One of the learnings of previous reform episodes in our continent include the fact that, when you rely excessively on cutting spending, what you're doing is harming development prospects, growth prospects, down the road. So more emphasis on revenues, we think, makes sense relative to cutting spending, given how much our countries continue to need to spend on health, on education.